you like? Never mind. Thought you might want to handle things. Okay, I have some questions here. Questions from
the distance student.
the distance, the people at a distance. Now, this isn't live for them, is it?
No,
So
we record.
I can edit this if I want to.
You know how, yes.
Let's see.
Otherwise, no.
Hello. This is from
Darja.
exactly. Someone read this for me here. I should go ahead. The top one.
All right.
She doesn't have one of those things. Is it a she or he?
It's a she.
Well, she asked you, today's America seems perhaps more divisive than what Madison had expected. In 10, Madison argues that a large republic with many factions and a government slightly removed from the people is a cure for the effects of factions. Since the election, it seems like there is more of an us versus them mentality within the country. And given the extent of communication technology and increased education among the masses, do you think that the type of republic Madison imagined is even possible anymore? Could it remain a viable or even beneficial solution to the problem of factions today?
Is Madison relevant today? I'll be saying a couple of different things here. First of all, how would the larger plug manufacturers? Oh, I guess what she's arguing is that the feeling that instead of having sort of multiple differences, that the differences are sort of us versus them. Yeah, he certainly would not want that kind of situation. That's the, and we're going to get into this a little bit more today, and I'm sure she'll understand a little bit better after when we talk about it. And I guess I would argue that the us versus them, or the notion that we're broken down into two large groups of folks, isn't. I would argue that the breakdown is not all that meaningful, in the sense that we still have most of the population. Sans perhaps never mind. We still have most of the population that sort of agrees on the fundamental rules of the game and what have you. We don't have differences at that fundamental level. We do argue with one another, but I don't think it's over. I don't think it's all that fundamental. Sam Hughes. Sam was actually in one of my classes. He's probably trying to play with me here. Sam was in your class, I believe.
He was right next to me, sat right next to me.
Why don't you read what Sam has to say?
Should I read in Sam's personality?
AKA sarcastic, I'm sure.
Yeah. A question that I have had since I took comparative politics as a sophomore, and the first past the post-election system was explained to me, is why we have this strong emphasis on factions during the founding, but the election system creates a dichotomous party system. The idea that there will be so many factions that they will check each other's power seems to be crippled by the form of elections we have.
Well, Washington didn't want a two-party system.
Oh, Sam. Sam would be correct if the two political parties were sort of diametrically opposed to one another. What tends to happen, compromise normally is going to happen in democratic society. It can happen before the election or after the election. And here it happens before the election in terms of what goes on within the two political parties. In other words, both parties tend to be sort of big, what we call big tent parties. So I mean, I can see what he's saying. There are only two groups, but the compromise, again, we'll talk more about this today. The coalitions that are developed within the parties, okay, as opposed to after the government forms. Take that, Sam. Okay, let's pick up where we last week. Seemed like a long time ago. Did I have a long weekend for some reason? I'm on my own at home. Yes, the woman I live with is out of town for a while. Should I do it? I probably should, yes. I'm having trouble with the magic box.
The microwave or the TV?
Neither. No.
Your blood pressure taker.
Yeah. Wow.
I take my blood pressure every day.
The
There's no
magic box
shame.
is in the kitchen. Okay, I took a carton of milk out of the magic box the other day. And I emptied it. Okay, I drank it all. And then, as I always do, I put it back in the magic box.
But it didn't refill itself this time.
I'll do the jokes. Okay? But then when I opened it up the next morning, it's been empty now for 2 days, so I'm having problems with the magic box. I did talk to Marlene on the phone. She said I could perhaps go to someplace called Dillon's and see what was in there. But that's the magic box is like the magic table in the living room, or the magic bedpost in the bedroom.
I don't know about these magical.
Yeah, I'm not gonna touch the levels of gender roles going on right now.
Yes, let's go there immediately, please. Oh, you try and stand up here and do the jokes. All right.
He's admitting that he has problems.
All right, let's pick up where we left off last week. We were talking about Madison's discussion in Trent Orders number 10, which deals specifically in terms of this problem of faction. But let's remember more generally what we're doing here. The argument is that the republic in the United States it's a new kind of republic. It's a modern republic. We talked about sort of pre-modern republics and modern republics last week. So, and the critical difference between, say, a pre-modern republic and the sort of republic that Madison would argue we have in the United States has to do with the fact that the pre-modern republics were based upon virtue. Okay, whenever republics began to fall apart or collapse in pre-modern times, the solution tended to be to work harder on the virtue, try and somehow make people more virtuous. In this modern republic, Madison argued, well, I think I mentioned this observation last week, that this would be the first republic that wasn't based upon an assumption of virtue, but rather we based this republic upon basically upon ideas of vice or selfishness. That's sort of the more general issue here. In 10, he focuses on faction, and we're back to, you can see there the way in which factions are defined, and both of the online questions were accurate. We're talking about first of all, what sort of factions relating to tyranny? What sort of tyranny are they concerned about at the founding? Is Madison concerned about? What sort of tyranny? Tyranny is of two varieties: majority tyranny and minority tyranny. Okay, which does Madison argue we should be concerned about?
Majority tyranny because
Please go ahead.
I thought it was majority tyranny because if a minority believes something, well, just crush them. But if the majority believes something bad that isn't
I haven't said you're wrong yet.
Oh, I just am very good at reading body language. Okay. Yeah, if the majority believes something that isn't congruent with a peaceful or productive society, then that's probably more harmful. We can probably get their way easier.
First of all, the colonial experience of the founding generation made them very concerned about minority tyranny, because that's what they saw happening with Great Britain. That the king and the elites surrounding the king were basically tyrannizing the majority in the colonies. But what Madison argues is that when you think about it, if the majoritarian principle, if you operate on the basis of that decision-making rule, okay, popular government, you got to have some way to figure out which of the people is correct, and normally it's some sort of majoritarian rule. And in that kind of situation, then the decision-making rule itself should deal with the issue of minority tyranny. Now, we could argue that that's really not sometimes how things work out, that minorities can can work their will in a variety of other ways, but let's not worry about that right now. So the issue then is and the woman here was correct, is majority tyranny. Right? That's the type of tyranny that is of concern here. Why be concerned about political minorities?
Might be concerned about minorities.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just kind of bringing it to a current event, I think that a lot of these alt-right factions we're seeing around the world, like in Germany and the factions in Japan in this recent election, who lost, but not by much, and then alt-right factions here and Brexit started out as minority groups, and they gained a lot of power, and we underestimated them when they were minorities.
How can you keep minorities from becoming majorities? Someone help her out, please. What I'm driving at here is there's another way to deal with minorities, which is through force. Okay? But the general idea is that long term, that's not an especially good strategy.
Placation?
Pardon?
Placating them?
Pardon?
Placating them?
Whatever, to keep them, to keep their desires from somehow becoming law. And that's one approach to that. That's the way that those sorts of viewpoints are treated, for a long period of time, and not in the United States. Madison, he's of the belief, he studied the fall of past republics and what have you, and in a correspondence, one of many correspondences with his wife, he says that the biggest challenge in a republic is basically to convince those that are being tyrannized to remain supportive of the government. And what he's saying there is that in the routine operation of a republic based upon a majoritarian decision-making rule, everybody with me? Okay? Based upon that kind of, there are going to be winners and losers every time. And the hope is that the losers aren't the same every time. But even if they are, the idea here is that if you respect what the losers have to say, if you allow them to have their say, if they're treated otherwise the same as then they're going to continue to support the system. So the answer to the question of why I worry about minorities is because it's with the option being force, the republic would only hold together for so long under those sorts of conditions. Okay, we talked about, this is the inevitability thesis. Faction is going to occur, Madison argues. Again, there were repeated attempts in previous republics to sort of forestall the development of factions, but eventually some sort of meaningful factional split developed, which would undermine the republics. So 10 is about curing them. What? Yes.
Maybe I'm thinking of factions wrong, but it seems like in our country, at least wealth and power division-wise, a minority rules most things and has a lot of power over the majority, which would be like the middle class, lower middle class workers. And so, like, how do they keep this?
So what is the minority that you see?
I see like a minority of like more wealthy, educated, powerful people. I mean, I guess they don't all have like a common belief like a faction would, but
Well, I mean,
they
that
have
certainly
commonalities.
that's a common sort of interpretation. That, I mean, if we're talking about Madison, then I'm not sure that he would buy into that. But yeah, I mean, your point is valid. It doesn't help us to necessarily to deal with what Madison has to say. But yeah, I think I would certainly agree on a variety of ways in which the few are able to sort of manipulate the many in order to get what they want.
In effect, have they
And
created
political
a faction
resources that are more important.
have they created a faction that can't be busted up by Madison's
So yeah, I guess
thinking?
are we going against the founders' intent in the way that people accumulate power and wealth and use it in this country?
Boy, that's a difficult question to deal with. Talking about the intentions of the founders, I guess my response would be it would sort of depend on which founder you were talking about. And that's not to avoid the question, but I don't know. Maybe one interpretation could be, okay, well, there's important stuff and there's less important stuff, and the majority works its will with the less important stuff, and the really fundamental stuff is managed by, and Madison's from Virginia. He was a member of the Tidewater aristocracy, like as Jefferson and Washington and so on and so forth. Lincoln, for example. If we take a look at Lincoln, we associate Lincoln with certainly notions of equality and what have you, but Lincoln was clearly of the belief that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, every once in a while needs some exceptional person, such as himself, to step in and maintain the republic. That's the argument that Lincoln. So there it is. Again, as to whether this somehow undermines it probably doesn't. Okay, so we're looking at two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. And this is the new slide, isn't it, right, Jim? Yes, I told you I'd get one of these things. I played around and did this morning. All right, so if we follow Madison's argument in 10, he says, okay, we can deal with the causes or we can deal with the effects. And for the history of the planet, this had been the approach over here, somehow dealing with the causes, either through some sort of dictatorship, some sort of totalitarian society, force, if you will, or trying, and this I guess could also be interpreted as totalitarian, trying to somehow promote more virtuous behavior. And when this comes to the New World, to the United States during the colonial period, early on in Massachusetts, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you were in a bad way. They were persecuting witches and so on and so forth. But eventually what happens, even though the colonies are still trying to promote different sorts of virtues, and we talked about this the other day, it's in a more sort of, democratic or subtle way. Okay, by sort of arranging things in such a way that so that people would be inclined to be virtuous, and keeping the community small and those. Think about Jefferson. Jefferson's emphasis upon agrarianism. And that was just one of many different ways in which we can kind of arrange things, these structures or institutions of society, in such a way so as to encourage people to think about the common good as opposed to their own narrow self-interest. So Madison looks at the causes, the turning to a dictator. Washington was around. That certainly was one option. I think, as I argued, that the dictatorship was the option that was taken by the French and also taken by the Russians after their revolutions. But the founders, for a variety of reasons, didn't want to go in that direction. Probably wouldn't have sold among the public. The other way we can go is, and Madison talks about, what's his term here? I can't remember the exact language off the top of my head. But he talks about, giving everyone the same sort of ideas and what have you. And he writes in such a way as to seem kind of ridiculous. He says, well, that's not going to happen as long as the reason of men continues to be fallible. What does that mean? What's the fallibility of all men?
Able to err.
Everybody? Okay. The irony of the fallibility of all is you would never know who was right. Okay, what's that? Okay, so Madison writes it that way when in fact that's how society is pretty much operating. We'll see how that. We'll see a little bit more about that today when we look in some detail at Diamond's article. But he sets these two aside as being unwise or unworkable or whatever, and then he turns to focus on the effects of faction. So okay, we're going to go ahead and we're not going to eclipse freedom, which is the basic ingredient in order for these factions to form. We're not going to do away with that. So let's think about what kind of factions we would expect to develop around what sorts of interest. Okay, what sort we expect to develop, and then think about, and then the question becomes: is there anything that a free government can do in order to control that sort of faction, once to keep it from engaging in some sort of majority tyranny? He talks about opinion-based factions. What were those all about?
Were they mostly on religion?
Yeah, it was religion, notions of right and wrong. Opinion sounds, sort of harmless. Everybody's got a different one, but Madison had, and he elaborates on it. He had something particular in mind here. The concern, the various religious wars are not that far in the rearview mirror, and the sorts of divisiveness and hatred that can be engendered by why? That's religious identification, kind of a bad thing.
I think that when you have this ideas of morality, you sometimes believe that they should be made into law.
Okay. Why is that a bad thing?
Well, because what if somebody else does, if somebody believes in Catholicism and I definitely don't, and they want to deny rights from me because they believe.
Can't you talk it out with them somehow?
I mean,
Maybe you could buy into the Trinity, or the Catholic could sell out, a member of the
I
Trinity
thought it
or
was
something?
like this Holy Spirit that was supposed to come into me, and it just
Okay,
does
fine,
not fix me.
fine. But I mean, do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, yeah, I get
Over
what
here,
you're saying.
somebody else. Can we just talk this thing out? Really?
I feel like
Go ahead, please.
it's something that's kind of more difficult just to talk out because it's something that people grow up believing is such a pivotal part of them. Like, it's not really something that's a choice for them. It's like, this is who I am. What?
Faith.
Faith, yeah.
At some level, I believe simply because I believe, and that makes and not that different religious sects haven't sort of compromised historically, but at least in principle, the idea here is that, if I sell out on this, I'm going to go to hell, and I'd rather not do that. So at some point, then, there's no more to talk about. Human passion is being aligned with, I don't know, some sort of charismatic or demagogically sort of selling out entirely to this personality, cult of personality. Okay. Examples.
Hugo Chavez.
Sure. Other examples. United States examples. Any?
Andrew Jackson.
Pardon?
Andrew Jackson.
Jackson's sort of undergone this renaissance, hasn't he? Wow. I really don't know. I mean, I studied Jackson a bit, but I don't see Jackson as I don't see him as a Hitler or someone
No,
or someone
but
such
like-
as that. But that could have to do
More so
with.
than, like, some other presidents.
Oh, all right.
Could you make an argument for Donald Trump?
Yeah.
I don't know. Could you make an argument for Donald
I
Trump?
definitely feel like I could. I don't know if people would believe it.
What about FDR?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh my God.
Well, I mean, it would sort of depend on which side of that you were on, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And it usually does. The house that I grew up in, my grandmother raised me, and in the hallway was the family pictures, and we were. I guess we were poor. We didn't know it. I mean, it wasn't that we weren't, out on the streets or something such as that. But at any rate, in the hallway there was pictures, and there was a picture of Christ. I always kind of wonder how they got them. Anyway, there's a picture of Christ. There's a picture of FDR, and then there was the family picture. So that.
There's your beliefs.
Huey Long, and yeah, you could certainly make a case for. I mean, there are people who sort of scratch their heads. How can, given everything that's happened over the last 8 or 9 months, how can he still have this sort of core base of support? And the response by some is it's unreasonable. It's sort of a cult of personality kind of thing. Human passion. And the one that we were working on at the end on Thursday is the one that Madison really wants to. His basic response is, okay, we hope this doesn't happen, we hope this doesn't happen because, we're screwed if it does. To put it simply. There's really nothing that's going to hold the republic together if people are aligning themselves with different religious groups or, that kind of thing. Property. Property-based factions. He identifies he talks about various and unequal distributions of property. Unequal refers to people dividing up on the basis of differences in the amount of property, the ultimate, the most, the worst possible division being, as they would phrase it, into the few rich and the many poor. Okay, so the rich are, they're trying to maintain their power, and the poor are trying to get a larger piece of the action. So that would be differences in amounts of property. What do you think it means by differences in kinds or various types of property? What do you think about? Pick up what he was after there.
Is it like old money versus new money?
No.
So like if your property brings in revenue for you?
Well, rich versus poor, that's a bad thing. Okay, and he hopes that doesn't happen as well. So what he's pushing towards is this notion of differences in kinds or various types of property. What do you think he has in mind there? Everybody has some property, just different kinds.
Necessary versus non-necessary?
No, just that.
It's just,
Because
because it's quality and quantity, right? Different kinds and different kinds.
Quantity has to do with amounts, but the argument here is that, we were sort of I hate to call us a middle class kind of country, but we end up being a country that lots of different people have different kinds of property.
So what are some examples of different kinds of property?
You normally associate a property with one's occupation. Okay, different kinds of farmers, for example. You got those folks. You got craftsmen. You've got merchants. You've got the beginnings of a manufacturing economy in the cities. Right, so that's the argument he's making. That as he compared, especially us to Western Europe. Now, other things are going on in Western Europe, the class system, which is legally enforced. Okay. But by the same token, he looked at the United States and he saw, wow, this is a lot of opportunity. Okay, for people to have different kinds of property, not to be impoverished, versus the situation in Western Europe where most of the land was used up and manufacturing was beginning to produce differences in terms of property and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So it's performed more so to jobs.
I'm sorry.
So it performs more so to jobs than it does.
He focused. Pardon?
Like sectors.
He really focused on occupations. Okay. Most people were farmers, but there were different kinds of farmers. Okay, people farm this, people farm that, and the idea was that you would associate with sort of basically what you were doing, and you would associate with others who are doing similar kinds of things. And so long as that level of association allowed you to achieve your self-interest, then you would have no incentive to enlarge the amount of the size of the group, if you will. Think about, I was going to do this later, but let's go and do it now. Think about how labor unions develop or any nation, but in the United States. All right. For a long time, there were no labor unions. Why not? Ideas? Why do labor unions form?
To get more rights for the workers.
Let's be a little bit more specific than that. Why do they form? Because
the workers are, well, it's not, I guess it's because they need more rights, so they have to be being like trampled upon in the first place. Because
you're on the right
there wouldn't
track.
really be a need for like worker unions if, like, I guess in the early 1900s when factories started popping up, if the owners would have initially started with like a good like working environment, so you need like poor working conditions essentially.
Collective action occurs basically because individual action is not successful. Okay, whether it's in terms of working conditions or whether it's in terms of compensation or whatever you want to talk about. All right, so I mean, initially there would be, you wanted to, I don't know, what would you like to, what would you like to buy? A new bed, all right, and you're living in some small town and there's one bed maker in town, all right, and you then go to the bed maker and you guys strike a bargain and it's to the benefit of both of you, okay? But eventually when that sort of approach, when sort of this negotiation between people who are buying and people who are selling begins to work to the detriment of the people doing the creating and the selling, then okay, well maybe, you know, we need to get, and this is how labor unions developed. They didn't exist for a long time because they weren't needed. And then the first stage of labor union development was that they were local unions. All right, so we have a carpenters union in Manhattan. And that was enough so that carpenters in Manhattan could get a fair deal. But then, I don't know, maybe it's bad, whatever that. But then, you know, we get automobiles also, we get carpenters coming in from Topeka and Wichita and so on and so forth, and the Manhattan car, and everybody's sort of getting undercut here. So then you form state level organizations and eventually national organizations. So that's the argument that, sort of the underlying basis of the argument that Madison is making here, which is ultimately people will continue to exist in these small groups so long as these small groups can help them to achieve their self-interest. But and we'll talk about the prerequisites later on, I mean, as the most obvious prerequisite here is economic prosperity. When economic prosperity begins to decline, then the size of the groups are necessarily going to get bigger. At the limit, there would be a working class movement in the United States if economic prosperity were, yeah, that's the way that argument works out. All right, so we're over here on kinds versus amounts. And let's get to that discussion. Again, few rich, many poor. Hope that doesn't happen because, you know, it's either the many are going to be repressed or the poor are going to look what happened in France. You know, it didn't go well for the rich in France. You had a question over there. You did earlier.
I don't believe so. I think I asked it.
No, you had one earlier and you didn't.
I don't remember.
Okay, if it comes back to you.
Sorry.
So how can we make this happen? How can we produce this situation where we have lots of basically different groups competing with one another for whatever society has to offer, as opposed to just two groups, the rich and the poor? From Madison, go ahead. Would you read the smaller?
Me?
Please.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, you don't have to name things out, so I don't know who you are.
The smaller the society, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party.
Go.
Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens.
Explain. What's he saying?
The more that you have, the more different interests there will be, the less there will be. I don't know, I need to read it again.
It's hard enough just to read it, let alone hoping someone else would interpret. I wasn't going after you. Mr. Lee, what do you got? What's small, big here?
Small thing.
I'll go at it. So the larger your society is, the more likely it is you'll have smaller factions, and then the less likely it will be that these factions will create a bipolar thing to eat each other apart. Does that make sense at all?
I can leave now. Very good. Yeah. Do that again, please.
So the larger your society is, the more likely that society will have smaller factions, which makes it less likely for there to be a majority, basically.
So this gets back to Sam's question a little bit. So why, in that case, majoritarian, not proportional? Like, why don't we have proportional voting where we'll have, a lot of small factions that reach consensuses? They'll all make compromises instead of, two parties that don't compromise very consistently.
Do you remember how I responded to Sam's question?
Two parties do compromise pretty
The,
But did they know that?
did-
But did they know that? That's the question. Like, I mean, I think they knew that. Like, I mean,
by they, you mean the founder?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Ask the question again.
Do they know that majoritarian?
Did they know?
Did they know?
Okay.
Past tense.
Yeah.
Did they know that majoritarian electoral structures would result in compromise, as opposed to proportional, which would result in a lot of little factions that in fact compromise?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is the compromise in the compromise in either situation has certain prerequisites, economic prosperity for both, okay? What happens in the two different situations is the compromise occurs at different points in the process, okay? And in majoritarian system, the compromise actually occurs before the election. These different groups of folks get together and decide, okay, we're going to support Donald Trump, and this other group of folks, we're going to support Hillary Clinton. So it happens then, and it also happens again in the legislature after the election. Right? But in a PR system, it happens after the election. Okay, we have all these different sort of groups, and you vote for a particular group, and then nobody gets enough, so you got to put several groups together. Okay, good.
So in our, two dominant party system, what happens if there's a failure to compromise before the election? Like all these people are like, well, no, Hillary's.
Then you lose.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Then
that
you lose.
compromising is vital.
Yeah, it's by virtue of the fact that whoever has one more than the other is how we're going to make decisions.
How do you feel about the Electoral College as opposed to every vote for itself?
That doesn't matter.
Population.
I'm not a fan of the Electoral College, but I don't want to go ahead and defend it. Yeah.
So, sorry, were you going to ask something?
No, I'd rather not do the Electoral College today.
Okay.
No, and it's not a bad question, I assume.
So they realized that in a majoritarian system, there would be a compromise prior to elections taking place, because you want to appeal to more folks. Like you want to appeal to a larger group of people,
Yeah,
so you're
you
going
want
to
to win.
compromise. That's what they wanted. Like they wanted a compromise prior to elections.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know that they thought about it in exactly that way, but yeah, that's what it amounts to.
Okay.
Is that
I guess what I'm getting at is like, was there ever a conversation that?
about PR? No.
Okay, I didn't think so.
And I don't know the answer to the question of why they didn't think about it, because
Okay.
there are a lot of other places on the planet, obviously, that use that sort of system. But the one that we did choose would tend to result in two ruling groups. Maybe that's why they did it that way. Because even at the time of the founding, there were winners and losers, and at least if you're losing at the time of the founding with this sort of majoritarian system, you're going to continue to play a role in the process. That sounds pretty good. All right, so we're talking about, I don't remember or not, but when we started on all of this, there were several quotations from the Federalist Papers about, Madison basically saying, give me a chance here, listen to what I have to say, this is really going to fly in the face of conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom had been that it's only in geographically small societies that republics can survive. Okay? Why do you think they would argue that? The answer is that so the argument goes that it's only in these smaller societies that are extremely homogeneous, similar to begin with, that people are going to basically agree on how they should live their lives. And if the objective is to establish this, may or may not get to today, to establish this this particular notion, a given society establishes a particular notion how people should live their lives, then if that's the objective, then yeah, you probably should best keep those republics pretty small. Because once you begin to get bigger, things begin to happen. Different opinions begin to consider the situation with Massachusetts. I may have touched upon this the other day. I mean, when the Puritans come over, it was just them and Native Americans, and all the Puritans were pretty much the same. and they're living out in the bush and what have you, and they basically, and they're all living the same, Hester, I guess it's maybe not, but anyway, they're all living basically, and then what happens is that Boston is a seaport. And into that seaport comes a lot of different sorts of people, and they begin to settle in Massachusetts, and all of a sudden you've got these, and if you watch the evolution of the Puritan church in Massachusetts, they go from, persecuting witches to basically being concerned about butts in the seats and backing off on a lot of the sort of rigid Puritan practices.
Does the advancement of communication affect
Absolutely.
that
It does.
community?
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons for, somebody asked me about the intentions of the founders, you know, one of the reasons, and you know, one of my answers to that is, why should we care about that? Well, it was like over 200 years ago. Yeah, what did he just say? I mean, you know, whenever some conservative really wants to give a clinch, you know, say, well, you know, it's the intention of the founders. I thought, well, that's fine, but that's a couple hundred years ago, and things were very much different then. Communications being one.
Yeah. With communication in mind, how does that affect the convention that only the geographically small areas could have republics? Like with the advancement of communication, does that idea of the geographically small areas kind of expand? Because I'm assuming that the homogeneous, because the communication and interaction is limited to that group, so they tend to become more isolated in those ways. So does the communication throughout the different cities and neighbors and areas, does that kind of grow the homogeneous feeling and kind of grow?
You know, it's certainly, I mean, we have become, as a population, I guess we could say, more homogeneous in some ways over time because of communication. You know, public school system, I mean, things such as that. Does it then follow that we're more like this small republic that Madison was so concerned about? Probably not, because I mean, we still have really important ways in which we see one another differently. And the technology gives us actually access to finding people like us in different places who see things differently. So maybe it even works to maybe it even cuts in the other direction to further fractionalize us in some ways. There's another hand over there. She's rested. She gave the answer.
I'm deep in thought right now. It's great.
No, I mean. And so again, the conventional wisdom is we've got to work in small republics, and Madison says, well, you know, only if you want to continue to push this virtue approach, and let's think about those small republics, okay? Is like everybody on the same page in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina? No, probably not. There are probably some people who don't buy into a particular lifestyle, whatever that happens to be, and they are vigorously repressed in those kinds of situations. I mean, the witches in Massachusetts were just women who saw things differently. I mean, they weren't really like cavorting with the devil or anything. They were just different. What's her name? The woman, Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson. Yeah, she's a brilliant woman. And you know, they run her out not because she was a witch or something, but because she just saw things differently. Okay. So what Madison wants to do then is to extend the sphere and take in a greater variety of parties and so on and so forth. From there, in terms of Madison's argument, he begins to talk about governing through coalition building. Okay, this what we call the coalition building process. How does coalition building operate? How does that work?
You need a certain amount of people to win, and so you make certain compromises to get more people on board.
Okay, so we've got, what do we have here, a dozen? Okay. So we need one more than half, okay. We got a dozen different interests in here. And each of you has some stuff that's really important to you. Things that you believe or ways in which you want to live your life or whatever the hell. okay, that you're not, wow, you're not gonna trade off on that. By the same token, you wanna get something out of this collective arrangement. So think about Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams, anybody? Yeah, circles that overlap one another, and this would be quite a few overlapping circles, but all that you're not going to agree about the stuff that's really important to you. The stuff that you simply aren't willing to make compromises about. By definition, okay, you're not gonna buy into that. All right. So in order for you guys to get, in order for you individually to get something out of collective action, those things have to be set aside. And all that's going to be left, again by definition, is what you can agree about, which I would argue would be not the stuff that's really all that important to you, or at least the stuff that you're not willing to compromise. I would equate the two. If you're not willing to compromise on about some particular matter, then that's really important to you, and if you want to be a member of the group, and if the group's not willing to entertain that, then you're either going to leave the group or set that aside. So think about the role of self-interest in this. Self-interest drives you to compromise. You want to get something from this collective activity, okay? And everyone has that driving desire, and that's what keeps you. That's what forces the groups to form, and that's also what forces you to set aside things that you can't, that are fundamental to you. Coalition building. So what Madison would say was, out of this private vice, this selfishness, different small selfish groups engaging in coalition building and the compromise that's associated with that, out of that comes a public virtue. In other words, out of all this vice comes a virtuous outcome. The virtuous outcome here is what?
Functioning society.
Stability. It's not exactly high-tone virtue, but if you think about the founders and their situation, they're looking at government number 3 in a period of about 10 years, so they're really concerned about stability. Pardon?
Could you please repeat what you just said? Washers.
I'm sorry?
Could you please repeat what you just said?
What did I just say?
Something about washers
When
resulting
you
in
harness
stability.
private vices,
Private vice
you
produces
produce
public
virtue in the form of a stable society.
Yeah.
In that you have a bunch of people who previously
Yeah.
disagreed and then you unite.
Yeah, I understand.
That might be an interesting sort of short essay question. How can private vice produce public virtue? Well, the question is that it can't produce sort of the old school type of virtue, but what it can produce is, I call it stability, you call it something else.
Functional society.
Functional society, isn't it?
Is it sort of like, I don't know, a societal version of Adam Smith's invisible hand argument?
This seems very pragmatic and harsh to me.
I'm sorry?
This seems very pragmatic and kind of harsh.
Well, these people were about, and again, when we get to Diamond, we'll see this again. These people are about talking about the is as opposed to the ought.
Because
The big change, let's hear me out. The big change in modernity is the, I think about Locke or Hobbes or somebody like that, no longer being concerned with telling people how they should have ought to live, but rather taking how they live, harsh though it may be, selfish though it may be, and and making something out of that, because going in the other direction, trying to somehow arrange things to promote virtuous activity. This hadn't worked. I mean,
Indeed was failing all around him.
yeah, exactly, and they excellent. They've got a good example of what of the sort of the inability of that approach to work in terms of what was going on with the colonies and between the colonies and at the time. So yeah.
it's just like, but what if the majority, factions come together and decide the thing they can agree on is discriminatory, or it's...
What do you mean, what if? That happens all the time.
Yeah, well, is that like...
I mean,
So they're okay with that? The founders are?
the founders' principal concern is really for some sort of stable regime.
So if it's stable but really crummy morally, it's still
It's-
stable?
I feel like it's pulling an all-nighter. Like, as a student, you know you should be studying, like, during all these times within the day, but at some point in time, like, it's crunch time and you gotta get some kind of product out of whatever you're doing. I feel like that's what Madison is doing. He's like, this is getting to the point where something needs to happen and I'm going to make that happen. Because he was watching all these colonies around him trying to do what you're saying and
Okay, I'm with
failing
you now.
miserably. So, like, imagine how frustrating that would be. Like, it's hard for us to empathize that because we're living in a society where, like, our voices are heard and stuff. Imagine trying to sew all these little things together into a quilt when they're all on fire and trying to right? He's just, like, grabbing for strings. I even wrote basic, minimally stable environment on my paper. And, like, it seems like, wow, this is not the ideal, but I don't think he was going for ideal. He wanted the fire.
Well, and I get that he's trying to be pragmatic, of course. It's just like hurts my heart to listen to somebody prioritizing political stability and, you know, government stability over morality.
But don't forget about the history part. Like, he was
Yeah,
a person, not
of
just
course.
this hypothetical mastermind.
I know.
Well, and to an extent, like once you have political stability, then you can like work to worry about that.
That's what
Okay.
my job is. That's
Yeah.
So he's just saying first stability, then we'll figure
Yeah.
the rest out.
No.
Well,
No?
No, it's a good point, but that Madison would disagree with. He would argue that the sorts of things you're talking about working towards, that's the sort of stuff that's really dangerous. That's the sort of stuff that there's always going to be some folks out there that are going to disagree with you, and they're going to get hammered in that sort of majoritarian warfare. I mean, the big change in modernity is to depoliticize all the really important controversial stuff. You know, we have the development in modernity of this private sector. We have the development in modernity of governments as opposed to regimes. What's the difference between a government and a regime? The regime touches all aspects of your life. The purpose of the regime is to promote a particular kind of humanness, a particular kind of character development or human excellence, whatever you want to call it. And in order to do that, it has to touch everything that we would consider to be in the private sector today. And in so doing, eventually there's going to be, and this is why republics kept falling apart historically. Eventually there's going to be some instability that develops, probably in I don't know, Moses in Egypt, you know, that kind of thing, creating those sorts of problems. Although Moses had a little more going for him. So yeah, where's the responsibility for that other? Well, no, I don't want to go there yet. But did you see what I'm saying? The two of you?
Mhm.
Yeah. Quote from 51. Okay. Why don't you read, please?
oh, in a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the
Multiplicity.
multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interests and sects, and this may be presumed to depend on the extent of the country and number of people comprehended under the same government.
It's just what we've been working on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Madison's argued to the effect that you extend the geographic sphere, and you're going to have a greater number of interest and sex. What are sects?
I always think of them as like pockets of society, kind of.
That wasn't what he had in mind.
And it was religious specifically, so different sects of a religion or different groups of people have slightly different.
Because each of the colonies would have had, say for Rhode Island, would have effectively had a state religion. Okay. And if you, I mean, it was becoming relaxed to some degree, but certainly if in some of the colonies, if you weren't a Quaker, for example, in Pennsylvania, it just wasn't a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And interest refers to economic interest. Multiplicity is sex. There's a lot in Madison that, somebody mentioned Adam Smith. You mentioned Smith, yeah. There's a lot of Smith, that it's like they're discussing gravity or something, isn't it? So, you know, you do this and that's what, hell, it's automatic. There's a lot of that in Madison. I mean, does that necessarily follow? Thus it may be presumed. Read that again, Mr. Nick. This may be.
This may be presumed to depend on the extent of country and number of people comprehended under the same government.
So if we just get a big geographic area, then we're going to have lots of different people. Not necessarily. Okay? Not necessarily. And even if we do have, coming from geography, different kinds of people, there are other prerequisites for this whole thing to work as Madison's describing. Wow, I did the lead into the slide after the story. That's sort of a professional mistake, isn't it? It's kind of a summary. How Madison saw things unfolding politically in a large versus smaller republics. We're talking about the large republic, which referring to the nations of